Before the new Aston Martin turns a single lap in Budapest, a rival driver admits on the record that he is nervous about it. He has heard what the rest of the paddock has heard, that almost nothing on this car is the same anymore. 16 new parts. A lighter chassis pushed back through a crash test in the middle of a season. And then on Friday morning the thing finally runs. And the gap that has defined Aston Martin's entire year does something it has not done once in 10 races. It gets smaller. That is Fernando Alonso's car, 13th on the timing sheet in first practice with a 1 minute 21.550, 2.475 seconds behind Charles Leclerc's Ferrari at the top of the order. On its own, a Friday morning practice time means very little. Fuel loads hide everything, engine modes hide the rest. But 7 days earlier at Spa, this same team qualifies more than 4 seconds off the pace needed to escape the first part of qualifying, with Alonso over 5 seconds away from pole position. Not 4 seconds off the front of the field, 4 seconds off the back of it. So when a 2 in front of the decimal replaces a 4, the shape of the sheet changes. 9 other garages notice it before the session is even over. The position matters as much as the time does. This is a team that has spent the season at the bottom of the screen, behind an operation that did not exist last year, watching the field vanish up the road on every straight. 13th puts Alonso in the middle of that field instead of underneath it. And this is the part that gets lost in a race weekend. Whatever the rest of that weekend produced, whatever the grid looked like on Saturday evening, and whatever happened on Sunday afternoon, those numbers get overwritten by the next event, and the one after that. The measurement Aston Martin actually needed came out of 2 practice sessions on a Friday, and it is the only measurement from Budapest that still means something a month later. Because Friday was never about a result, it was a test of whether the factory works. One detail from that first hour is easy to miss. 5 teams hand a first practice car to a young driver in Budapest. McLaren, Mercedes, Alpine, Haas and Cadillac all sit a race driver out for the session. Aston Martin does not. Both race drivers are in both cars from the first green light. When a team brings 16 new parts and a chassis that has just been through a fresh crash test, the mileage is too valuable to spend on anybody except the 2 people who have to drive it on Sunday. Before any car runs in Budapest, the FIA publishes the car presentation documents for the weekend. Every team has to declare what is new on the car and explain why. A typical entry lists 1 item, occasionally 2. And a big weekend for a midfield team runs to 4 or 5. Aston Martin's entry runs to 16. Front wing end plate, nose, front corner, floor body, floor fences, floor edge, diffuser, side pod inlet, engine cover, cooling louvres, rear suspension and rear corner, rear wing, beam wing, rear wing end plate. The team groups them, and the grouping is the interesting part. The front wing, the end plates, and the nose are declared together as one package, meant to improve how the front of the car works, in combination with everything else that changed. The nose itself is longer and thinner than the one it replaces. The 4 floor items are also declared as a single package, and the stated goal is blunt. More load out of the floor, not a tidy up of one edge, changes across every surface the regulations allow them to touch. The rear wing is the third group. Aston Martin redistributes the wing's dimensions across all 3 elements and adds small winglets to the trailing edge of the flap. The purpose is to raise the load the car makes in corner mode while cutting the drag it carries in straight mode. 16 parts is not an upgrade. 16 parts is a different car wearing the same name. To understand why those 3 groups and not some other 3, you have to look at what these cars are now. The 2026 regulations rebuilt the sport from the ground up. The power unit splits its output almost evenly between the combustion engine and the electrical side, with roughly double the energy recovery of the cars that came before. The fuel is fully sustainable. The bodywork is smaller and the cars are lighter. And instead of a single movable rear flap, both the front and rear wings now change shape, switching the whole car between a high-load corner mode and a low-drag straight-line mode. Every one of those changes punishes a heavy car harder than the old rules did. Less downforce overall means the floor has to work for every point of load it can find. A power unit leaning that heavily on stored energy means the car has to be efficient in a straight line, or it arrives at the next corner with nothing left. And a wing that has to be good in 2 completely different configurations leaves nowhere for a compromise to hide. Read the 3 upgrade groups again with that in mind, and they stop looking like a shopping list. The front package exists because the car could not get into a corner. The floor package exists because it could not generate load through the middle of one. And the rear wing was costing them in one mode to protect the other, which is a compromise these rules no longer let you make. They did not bring 16 parts because 16 parts were ready. They brought 16 parts because fixing any one of those areas alone would have moved the balance somewhere else and cost them what they gained. Except calling it 16 parts still undersells it, and the correction is the part almost nobody reports properly. The chassis underneath all of it is not new. Adrian Newey has been clear about this. The main structural elements stay where they were. The chassis and the gearbox architecture do not fundamentally change. What changes is what they weigh. Weight has been taken out of both, and taking weight out of a chassis in the middle of a season is not a paperwork exercise. It forces the team to homologate the structure again and put the forward chassis through a fresh crash test. The front suspension is untouched. The rear suspension is revised, but only slightly. Everything else that meets the air is new. That crash test is the detail that tells you how bad things had become. Teams do not rerun structural crash tests mid-season. It costs money inside a budget cap that is already tight. It costs weeks of engineering time that could go into next year's car. It carries the risk that the structure fails the test and the whole program slips. You only accept all of that when the weight itself is the thing beating you. The 2026 minimum car weight sits at 768 kilograms, and the AMR 26 has been running above it since Australia. Reports out of the paddock put the excess at somewhere between 10 and 15 kilograms. The rough conversion used up and down the pit lane is that 15 kilograms is worth something close to half a second a lap. Half a second, given away before the car has turned a wheel, on a car that already had nothing to spare. That is not a setup problem. That is not a driver problem. The car was born too heavy, and it could not be made lighter without going back to the crash structure and starting again. So they went back to the crash structure and started again. The arithmetic that follows is worth sitting with, because it explains why 16 parts was the minimum rather than the maximum. Over the 4 race weekends before Hungary, the analysis doing the rounds put Aston Martin roughly 4.5 seconds off pole position and around 2 seconds away from the time needed just to survive into the second part of qualifying. Not to reach the third part, not to fight for points. To get out of the first session on a Saturday, take the weight fix at face value, and it returns something in the region of half a second. That leaves roughly 1.5 seconds still to find, from aerodynamics alone, before this car does the thing every other car on the grid does as a matter of routine. That is the size of the target. The front package, the floor package, and the rear wing package were built to hit. Not a podium, not a points finish. A second qualifying session. There is a version of this story where that sounds like defeat. It is the opposite. A team that knows exactly how much time it needs and exactly which surfaces have to produce it is a team that has finally worked out what is wrong with its car. If you had asked anyone in the Silverstone paddock in February what this season was going to look like for Aston Martin, they would have told you about Adrian Newey, about a works Honda engine, about the technology campus and the wind tunnel Lawrence Stroll built to order rather than rent. They would have described a team stepping up. They had no idea. In Melbourne, Alonso qualifies 2.462 seconds off pole and both cars retire. China brings another double retirement, and so does Barcelona. Reliability only steadies from Miami onward, and by then the season has already been decided for them. 10 rounds in, Aston Martin has 1 point. Alonso, 10th place in Monaco, and only after a penalty is applied to Sergio Perez ahead of him. Stroll has none. The team sits 10th in the constructors' table, 9 points behind Audi in 9th, with only Cadillac's empty column below them. Put that next to what the rest of the grid has been doing with the same rulebook. Mercedes leads the Constructors' Championship with 358 points and 8 victories, 73 clear of Ferrari on 285. McLaren sits 3rd on 195. Red Bull is 4th on 151. Kimi Antonelli leads the drivers' standings on 204 points with 6 wins, 6 pole positions and 8 podium finishes, 45 ahead of Lewis Hamilton. 358 against 1. Same regulations, same calendar, and the same 18 months of preparation sitting there for anybody who wanted to use it. And the measurement that stung most inside the team was not the championship table at all. It was qualifying. The last time an Aston Martin beat a Cadillac on a Saturday was Canada, and Cadillac is the team that did not exist last season. Newey has explained where the hole comes from. Serious work on this car does not begin until the middle of March last year. The first model does not go into a wind tunnel until the middle of April. They wait, deliberately, for their own tunnel to come online instead of borrowing time in somebody else's. Every rival started months earlier. That is the car that arrives in Budapest. And that is why the sheet from those 2 sessions matters more than a practice sheet normally would. The second session begins in the late afternoon, and the conditions are unhelpful. The air is cool. The wind is up. Grip is low across a surface that is partly new tarmac. Franco Colapinto puts his car off at the final corner and brings out another red flag, which costs everybody running time. Lewis Hamilton tops it with a 1 minute 18.729. Leclerc goes second, Lando Norris third, Max Verstappen fourth, George Russell fifth. Alonso finishes 19th, 2.990 seconds back. On the face of it, that reads worse than the morning. It is not, and the reason is who is around him. Valtteri Bottas is 18th in the Cadillac, 2.713 off the top. Sergio Perez is 20th in the other one, 3.063 off. Aston Martin is sitting between them. Alonso also has a quicker lap taken away for track limits. With it, he is around 17th. Now put that against Spa. 7 days earlier, Aston Martin qualifies more than 2 seconds behind the slower of the two Cadillacs. Not level with them, not near them. 2 seconds behind the newest team on the grid. In Budapest, one Cadillac is ahead by under 3/10 and the other is behind. Stroll is not in that classification at all, and the reason goes back to the morning. 11 laps into first practice, the rear of his car steps out on the exit of turn 2 and spins him toward turn 3. A red flag comes out and the session stops. His best before it happens is a 1 minute 23.471, set in traffic on a track that was still rubbering in. He never runs again. The damage from the morning cannot be repaired in time, and the problem is made worse by something nobody planned for. The new bodywork does not fit the old parts. Spares that would normally cover a rebuild are the wrong specification. The team ends up flying components into Budapest overnight, simply to guarantee both cars can carry the package into qualifying. 1 weekend of upgrades, and the garage runs out of the version of the car it just built. That risk was live before the weekend even started. Whether there would be enough of the new parts to run both cars in the specification the team wanted was described inside the operation as the expensive question of the weekend, and Friday morning answered it in the worst possible way. A single mechanical problem on one car consumed the margin for both. It is a small thing next to a lap time, and it is also exactly the kind of thing that separates a team producing an upgrade from a team able to race one. Building 16 parts is a factory problem. Building 32 of them, plus spares, on a budget cap, in the middle of a season, while the design office is already working on next year, is a different problem entirely. The number on the screen is the headline. What Alonso says afterward is the part that actually matters to the next 12 months. He says the car feels good. He says the team got what it expected in terms of numbers, and in terms of correlation. Correlation is not a word that excites anybody outside a factory, and inside one, it is the only word that counts. Correlation means the wind tunnel and the simulation agree with what the stopwatch does at the track. When correlation is broken, a team is developing in the dark. Parts that look like gains in the tunnel arrive at a circuit and do nothing, or make things worse, and there is no way to tell which until the truck is already unloaded. For 10 races, this team had been in exactly that position, building parts, shipping parts, and watching them fail to show up in the timing. Budapest was the first weekend all season where the tools told the truth. That is worth more than 3/10, and it is worth more than any single grid position. A team with working correlation can develop. A team without it is guessing with a budget cap running down. Alonso goes further. He says he no longer sees a big deficit in the corners compared to the top of the midfield. Alex Albon, watching from a Williams that has spent the season comfortably ahead of them, agrees with that read from the outside. The vibrations that troubled the car in the morning are, in Alonso's words, more or less fixed by the afternoon. Which brings us back to the car that stopped, and to the part of it nobody can explain. The timing is precise. The failure comes around 36 minutes into the session, with just over 20 minutes still to run. The car is recovered, and it does not leave the garage again. The component that gives up is not one of the 16 that changed. Newey's account is short, and it is the most unsettling sentence of the weekend. The area involved is not what has been changed. In that sense, he says, it was completely unexpected. Pedro de la Rosa confirms after the second session that it is a suspension failure, and that the team is confident enough in the cause to keep Alonso on track, rather than park both cars. From the outside, one former technical director looking at photographs offers a reading. A bonding problem in the forward leg of the rear suspension, made worse by the loads the curbs at this circuit put through it. That is a provisional view built from images, not a finding. So the team went into the rest of that weekend, carrying an unexplained mechanical failure on a component it had not touched. On a car it had rebuilt almost entirely around that component. In the same month it signed off a new crash structure. There is one more thread, and it runs through Honda. The engine has been generating oscillation, and Honda's trackside leadership confirms they observed it again in Budapest. They also say they know the cause, and that it is different from the vibrations that troubled the program earlier in the year. De La Rosa's version is that Honda is on top of it. That matters because Honda has its own step coming, and it did not come in Hungary, which is the point Newey makes when the sessions are done, and it is the sentence that reframes everything those 2 hours produced. The provisional results, he says, are promising, but it is only part of the package. There are more steps coming at Zandvoort, and further steps after that at Monza and Baku. Read that with the timing sheet in front of you. The 2.990 in second practice is not what this car is capable of. It is what this car is capable of with stage 1 bolted on. in cold and windy conditions on a track that had been resurfaced, with the old engine still in the back of it. Zandvoort brings the next tranche of aerodynamic parts and the upgraded Honda power unit at the same time. That sequencing is deliberate and it is not free. Every hour spent making this season's car quicker is an hour not spent on next season's, and Newey has confirmed the design office is already researching the 2027 car alongside all of this. A team in 10th place with 1 point has the strongest possible argument for writing this year off and pouring everything into the next one. They have chosen not to do that, and the reason is written into the correlation number rather than the lap time. A team that cannot trust its wind tunnel cannot build a good car for any season. Fixing this year's car is how they prove the tools work before they commit the next 18 months to them. Budapest was never really about Budapest. It was a test of whether the factory that produced the slowest car on the grid has learned enough to be trusted with the one after it. The figure that had been circulating in the paddock for what the Hungary package alone is worth is around 2.5 seconds. That is understood to be the team's own best case, and it is a target rather than a result. But even taken as a target, it tells you the scale of what they believe they have built. The rivals were not waiting for confirmation. Before the car had turned a single lap, Bottas admitted publicly that he was a little bit nervous about it. He had heard the same rumor everyone else had, that the only piece carried over from the old car was the front suspension, and that everything else had been thrown away. He was close to right, and he was worried about it while sitting in a car that had been comfortably quicker for 10 races. By Friday evening, Perez put it more plainly. Aston Martin were in the fight. The race pace looked strong. They would be hard to beat. That is a driver from the newest team on the grid, talking about the team with 1 point. And it is still the most uncomfortable sentence of the day for the 6 or 7 garages sitting between them. There is one more consequence sitting underneath all of this, and it has nothing to do with a single lap time. Fernando Alonso's contract expires at the end of this season. He confirmed in Budapest that he is contracted and that he is not going anywhere. But he has been equally clear that whether he keeps racing at all is a separate question. That decision, he says, comes down to whether these cars still give him something worth showing up for. Newey has been open about what he wants from that. If the upgrade performs, he hopes Alonso is in the cockpit for another season. 2 hours of practice in Hungary were the first evidence in 10 rounds that the answer might be yes. The real question was never whether the package works. Both sessions suggested it does, in the crude way a Friday can suggest anything. The question is what the number looks like once the Zandvoort parts and the Honda engine arrive together, and whether that number lands early enough to convince the most experienced driver on the grid that the last chapter of his career is worth writing here. 16 parts, 1 crash test, half a season gone. Zandvoort is where we find out what it was all actually worth. If you want that one, the next package, and what it does to the order, subscribe and it will find you.